Hi there. My name's Dr. Tim Grivois. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Executive Director of TGS Educational Consulting. I do a lot of work with schools in just about every non curricular aspect of things that need to happen to help schools run. And a big part of my work right now is really supporting schools and building inclusive classrooms for students with ADHD. Now, for the longest time, a lot of that work had to do with dealing with some of the more obvious symptoms of ADHD, some of the more of the hyperactive kinds of things that we might see, or just distractibility, or just hard to direct students' attention towards the learning. But one of the things is also very, very clear is that ADHD absolutely affects working memory, and working memory is an essential component of turning things into long-term learning that's going to last a lifetime. And so one of the things that we could really do to support our students with ADHD is to make sure that we're putting into place some research-based classroom possible strategies that can also support working memory. And I'm going to talk about that just really quickly with just an example of helping my own child with ADHD with a vocabulary quiz that she had recently. Just to get started into a little bit about me, just this is some great people that I had a chance to spend this summer with. The ocean happens to be my family's happy spot, and it was such a pleasure to get to enjoy my family and some amazing friends out by the ocean. Now, I was really excited that this year I actually happened to be the parent where my kids were at on the first day of school. Because usually the way it works is they're at their other parents' house for the first day of school, but they just happened to be that the calendar changed and they got to be with me this year, and so it was nice to be able to celebrate that. This is my partner LaShawn, and these are my youngers. They go to an elementary school here in Tucson, and I just realized that, oh my goodness, in both of these pictures, it looks like I'm celebrating my first day of school. This definitely not what I'm trying to do, but but I can totally see why it looks like that just a bit. Hi there, my name's Dr. Tim Gravoy, and I'm the executive. Hi there, my name's Dr. Tim Gravoy, and I'm Hey there, my name's Dr. Tim Gravois, and I'm the Executive Director of TGS Educational Consulting. We do lots and lots of work with schools and just about every non curricular mental health, social emotional learning, a behavior based thing that needs to happen to help students be successful at school and help adults be their most successful in navigating all of these different spaces. And a big part of that work has been in supporting students with ADHD and how we can build inclusive classrooms that work better for all students, but particularly for students with ADHD. Now, that work really started with a lot of the more obvious symptoms of ADHD, some of the more like perhaps hyperactive kinds of things, gross motor gifted things we sometimes see with kids with ADHD, also things that we can do to help support attention and helping direct attention to where the learning is happening. But one of the things that's really important to know is that the most important aspect of ADHD that affects learning and school success usually isn't the most visible. And that tends to be struggles with working memory. It is very common that people with ADHD have significant struggles with working memory, and that can be a very big challenge to learning. Now, thankfully, it's only an issue if we don't provide the necessary supports. And there are some research based, classroom possible, evidence based supports that we can put into place that tend to work. And I'm going to use some examples from my own daughter with ADHD and a recent vocabulary quiz that we had to get ready for not too long ago. Now, just to get to know me a little bit better, here's my family and friends. This is us on a trip to the ocean. The ocean happens to be our family's happy spot, and so anytime we get the chance to spend some time on the beach, it really is just a privilege and an honor and an absolute gift to have that uninterrupted time together. I'm really super excited that this year it just happened to be that I got to have my kids at my house for the first day of school. Usually, the way the calendar works, they're at their other parents' house, but this year the calendar changed, and I got to be with my kids in the first day of school. So this is me and my partner dropping off the youngers on the first day. This is me dropping off my oldest on the first day of school, and I'm just it was just really just a lot of fun for sure. Now, my one of my youngest kids is losing all sorts of teeth right now, and this particular tooth would have been a whole lot easier to deal with if the tooth fairy happened to have my daughter's Venmo account. Now, obviously, my daughter doesn't have a Venmo account, but she lost this tooth on a day that I had no cash whatsoever, except that I happened to find, like, in a random desk drawer somewhere, some quarters that I had left over from, like, playing darts at karaoke one time. So she got $5 in quarters from the tooth fairy there. Now, just in case you're curious and want to have some more Pokemon friends, I've also happened to be a Pokemon player, and I was just really excited that I'm starting to fill out some more of my Oshawotts there too. I just think otters are really cool. So if you got a shiny Oshawott you're willing to trade me, I'd be absolutely delighted for that. But in any case, it's an absolute pleasure to spend this time with you, and I'm really glad that you stumbled upon this video here. All right, so what is working memory? Just concretely, working memory is the ability to hold and manipulate information over short periods of time. So, for example, if somebody says, hey, what's that address? I need to put it into Siri. And so when somebody tells you that address, oh, it's 3858 East Portobello Road. Well, if somebody tells you that, you can remember it for a short time while you type it into Siri. That right there is working memory. And that working memory is a core executive function. So the ability to remember, for example, multi-step directions, that's working memory. The ability to be able to take a whole bunch of vocabulary words in a list and memorize those definitions, that's going to start as a working memory task long before it becomes a long-term memory task. So working memory really is the ability to hold information inside my head, do stuff with it, and be able to use it to produce some kind of learning. Mental math, for example, is a great example of working memory. It's a core executive function, and it's the core executive function that tends to be really, really affected by ADHD. So how does ADHD affect working memory? Well, working memory impairments, they're just a core feature of ADHD. If a person with ADHD, it's very unlikely not to struggle with some aspects of working memory. Other thing that's important to know about working memory is that the impact of this crosses subject areas in all types of learning. It doesn't matter whether we're memorizing something for a theater class or learning states and their capitals in social studies. The impact of how working memory can affect learning is all subjects, all types of learning. And it really is linked to academic and real world challenges. It's really important to know that it's not just about learning that happens in school, learning how to support our own working memory. If you're a person like me with ADHD, is going to be a really important thing to navigate academic success, is also how to navigate some real world challenges that come along too. So what are some things that we can do to support working memory? Well, thankfully, there actually are some things that we can do. And I want to share some of those strategies that worked particularly well with my daughter's recent vocabulary test. Now, my daughter and I don't share any DNA, but we absolutely do share ADHD somehow. And the thing that we both similarly struggle with is memorizing things that we have to present. And so this particular test was, I think there was like 20 some words. And the task was to learn those 20 odd words. They all had different Greek and Latin prefixes attached to them, and also know what part of speech was and what part of speech each one was, and also the definition for each of those words. So if you can imagine, for a child with ADHD, here's your 20 vocabulary words. Please memorize the words, the definitions, the prefix and their definition, as well as the part of speech. That is a very challenging working memory task for neurotypical students, but certainly is going to be for students with ADHD. And so thankfully, there were some things that the classroom teacher was doing that were amazing, that fell right along with these strategies for supporting working memory. And the evidence-based classroom possible strategies that we know definitely can help to support kids with working memory are goal setting, chunking instruction, visual schedules and task cards, flashcards, and then retrieval practice. Now, goal setting is a pretty simple goal, honestly. At first, my daughter had these 20 flashcards that she had. She wasn't feeling particularly confident with any. So the first thing we did was we said, all right, kiddo, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go through these flashcards. Any word that you know well, I'd like you to set it to the right. Any word that you kind of know, put it in the middle. Any word that you're absolutely sure you don't really know just yet, keep it on the right-hand side. And so that we have 3 different piles. So on the left, we have the words that we know well. In the middle, words that we kind of know. And then on the right, we have the words that we don't know so well. And so we went through them one time. The very first time we did this, there were 4 out of 20 that she felt confident that she knew the part of speech and the definition, as well as the Greek and Latin root that went with it. And so we set a goal. Like, all right, right now we know 6. Let's go through this a couple more times. Let's see if we know 10 in 10 minutes. And so we did it again. Turns out we knew 10. We did it a few more times. Turns out we knew 12. And by setting that goal, there was an intentionality that really supported that working memory. It became very clear that growth over time was the goal here. And it really actually showed that the growth was possible and that working memory was really getting supported. The next thing that we did also is we chunked instruction. Now, part of that chunking happened just by focusing only on the words that we didn't know well yet, and moving them into the pile of words that we kind of knew, and then moving the words that we kind of knew into the words that we knew very well. So we weren't focused on all 20 words at any given time. We were only going to be focused on one of those piles. And then chunking that instruction really preserved a lot of that cognitive load, and so that we were only doing the working memory task with the words that we really needed to focus on most. Now, I think that the other thing that we did to chunk instruction was because there were different Greek and Latin roots that were part of that. We didn't necessarily do every single Greek and Latin root every single time. We focused on just one of them at a time. And by focusing on one at a time, we were able to chunk that instruction and get similar kinds of definitions and words together, that it just made it easier to learn that whole list of 20. And we can think of this working in any kind of ways. If students need to memorize the 50 states and capitals of the United States, for example, we can focus on regions at a time rather than necessarily the entire map all at once. There's all sorts of ways that we can chunk instruction so that we're giving students bite-sized pieces to chew on rather than an entire meal that has to be consumed in one sitting. Especially with students with ADHD, they're just not going to be able to consume giant chunks of information all at once, and chunking it into little bits can be a very powerful way of supporting working memory. Now, the next thing are things like visual schedules and task cards. In this case, the visual schedule was honestly the flashcard in this case. The flashcard really was the thing that I don't have to remember it in my head if it exists out on this flashcard. I just need to get familiar with that content in the flashcard. And the flashcard itself served as a task card too. It was very clear what I needed to do. I needed to go through these cards, and I needed to make sure that they were all in the correct piles here. Now, in other ways that we can make this work is instead of giving oral instructions or verbal instructions to students, we can make sure that those instructions are visually laid out. Now, visually laid out could be in writing, it could be on a whiteboard, it could be in pictures. There's all sorts of ways that we can take something inside our head and put it out. And honestly, a Post-it note is one of the best ways, in my view, to make a visual schedule or a task card because it's very readily available and something the students more or less already know how to use. So visual schedules and task cards can be as complicated and Pinteresty as we want, or they could be as simple as a Post-it note, so long as what we're doing here is just taking the stuff that needs to be worked with inside the head and putting it outside the head. So for example, if I were to say, what can we do to support working memory? Please repeat that sentence back to me. That wouldn't be too hard. But if I said, please repeat that sentence alphabetically, that would be a much more difficult thing to do. And it would be easier to do if you had Post-it notes of all of those words that you could manipulate and change that way and make it a very tactile visual kind of thing. Now, the simplest way to do a visual schedule and a task card is to write it on the whiteboard and follow it and refer to it and gesture towards it as you're doing it. That on its own is going to be a huge support to working memory for all your students, but in particular for kids with ADHD. Now, for a while, I think that flashcards perhaps got a bad rap in education, where we really wanted to focus on higher order thinking skills, and we didn't want to focus necessarily on stuff that was just rote learning. Now, I agree, rote learning is the foundation. It is not the ceiling of what we want students to know, understand, and be able to do. Now, that said, I'm not sure that my daughter is going to successfully read Greek and Latin literature if she doesn't have a good handle on all these Greek and Latin roots and prefixes and affixes that go with the vocabulary that exists in the English language. The start of all of this really is just learning stuff so that we're able to manipulate that information inside our head. And flashcards can be a very supportive way of doing that, and especially in any kind of content area where vocabulary is getting taught. Flashcards can be a really big support with that. And then the next part really goes along with flashcards, and that's retrieval practice. So when we make our brain remember something, there's something about how those dendrites wire together that makes that memory easier to access later. And students with ADHD are going to need a lot more rehearsals and a lot more opportunities for retrieval practice to cement those memories. So when we think about, for example, a person on a stage who needs to remember a monologue or needs to deliver a whole bunch of lines from memory and needs to learn it from heart, one of the best ways to memorize that is to actually just sit and do it, to make yourself remember things that you need to know. And when we have that retrieval practice, it tends to wire those neurons together. So how it might look in a classroom is, okay, let's take a look at these vocabulary words. I want you to look at this one, flip the card over and read the definition. Now I want you to turn the card over and tell your neighbor what that definition is without looking. Now, the first few times, students might struggle with this. You're kind of supposed to struggle. It's the struggle that helps wire those memories together. And so it's important, especially if we're working with students for, that maybe are not kind of used to struggling and sort of things tend to come naturally for them. And this is going to be a bit more of a difficult thing. That retrieval practice is supposed to be a bit difficult. Now, there's times where I've done retrieval practice activities in rooms full of teachers and educators and administrators where it was clear that this was a very high stakes activity that wasn't really high stakes at all, but it felt high stakes when they were doing that. And so sometimes when we can cue learners when we're doing these retrieval practice activities that it's not graded, it's just something we're doing to make our brains work so that that learning gets cemented. And all the retrieval practice means is I'm going to put something into my working memory. I'm going to take the visual away. I'm going to see if I can remember it without the visual. And then I'm going to compare what I was able to produce to the visual and see how closely it matched. And over time, that retrieval practice becomes one of the best things that we can do to support working memory. And kids with ADHD are going to need a lot more access to those kinds of things. And so it kind of makes us think perhaps that when we think about homework and stuff like that, for some of our kids with ADHD, it might be really good to have some homework, but making that homework really focused on retrieval practice of stuff that they've had a chance to learn in class already. That could be a really powerful way to support working memory. Well, I just want to thank you for being here, and I can't wait to hear what you do to live all of this learning out loud. If there's things that you do that you know are supporting your students' working memory, drop all those great strategies in the comments. And again, thank you so much for being here. It is an honor. Yep. And thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to see how you live all these learning. I can't wait to see how you live all this learning out loud. It's an honor to be here, and I can't wait to hear all the strategies that you have to share in the comments below. And as always, I just hope that all of the amazing people that stumble across these videos have as many opportunities to be as good and kind to themselves as they are with the students and families that they serve.